Brought to you by Moonbeam Multimedia.
This is 16 to 1, a podcast about education, teaching, and learning.
Hello, listeners. Thanks for joining us this week. We know that the end of the school year is in sight for many of you, and we hope you're hanging on through the frenzy of finals and graduations. This week on the show, we're joined by guest Vivian Van Gelder, Director of Policy and Research at Southeast Seattle Education Coalition, a community-driven nonprofit and network of more than 50 organizations, along with schools, parents, and caregivers, united behind equitable education policies for children and families in Southeast Seattle. Vivian is the lead author of a report called Left Chance: Student Outcomes in Seattle Public Schools, A Forensic History. It's a sweeping and detailed analysis of one public school district's leadership and policy choices over more than 3 decades, and how those choices have shaped outcomes for students with a wide variety of educational needs. We think there's a lot to be learned from this report and from researchers like Vivian, who are doing the hard work of holding intractable social problems up to the light in a way that can spark progress and ignite momentum behind reform. We spend significant time discussing Seattle public schools in this episode, but Katie and I were struck by just how familiar some of these tensions are to what we've heard from educators in Appalachian, Ohio, or to friends in suburban Maryland and rural Alaska and the Deep South, all over the country. This report gets at universal questions of values and organizational leadership in public schools, and we encourage you to read it, and we'll link to it in our show notes. Before we dig in, just a quick reminder, there are only a couple of episodes left in our current season of 16 to 1, and we're going to be on break for the summer months. We're coming back in early September, though, when school's back in session. We're going to bring you new episodes and new conversations with veteran educators and researchers. In the meantime, we encourage you to sign up for an email newsletter to keep up to date on all of our workshop offerings, resources, events, and podcast announcements. We don't send very many newsletters because we know how cluttered inboxes can get, but we deeply appreciate those of you who do take the time to support us in this way. Thanks for listening to 16 to 1. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to hear just a little bit about you, your work for Southeast Seattle Education Coalition, how you got involved with the organization, and what you do.
Okay. It's kind of a long story, but I'll try and keep it short. I came to this work as a parent. So I grew up in Sydney, Australia. I've been in the United States for more than half my life. And we moved here to Seattle in 2009. And my older child started kindergarten in the Seattle public school system in 2013. And within a couple of years, I became involved in the PTA at my child's school. Seattle being a very segregated city, like many big cities, our neighborhood served a mostly white and mostly affluent population. I became involved with the PTA and suddenly discovered that it had a very large budget and that most of the budget was going into the local school for teachers and programs and supplies and things like that. And that kind of struck me as odd. So that sent me down a very deep rabbit hole of trying to understand how resources are allocated within the district, because I knew that there were other schools that didn't look like my kid's school that probably didn't have all this extra money from parents, and trying to figure out how, and this is in a district with a very strong stated commitment to equity and to equitable educational resourcing. And I was like, I don't understand how this is possible. And folks told me, no, it's fine because, those other schools get all this Title I money, so it's totally fine. And then, I had a lot of conversations with a lot of people in a lot of different parts of the city over the years, and people in positions with the school district and people who weren't. And, came to kind of realize that actually this wasn't an equitable process. And in the course of that, did some more intentional advocacy work with families and PTA, and became very involved in the PTA hierarchy, and then also became involved in Southeast Seattle Education Coalition, which at that time and even now would have these monthly coalition meetings that welcomed anybody and would talk about the application of policy issues basically to students in the southeast part of Seattle, which is historically and still the area of our city that is less affluent, is more like, more of the families are immigrant families or families of color. And these are schools that for generations have been under-resourced. And so getting involved with CSEC was really kind of the next logical step of this process. And then in 2021, I was extraordinarily fortunate to land a job with them as their director of policy and research.
That's just fascinating work. You do this deep dive into how school systems are working and serving your communities.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we should just jump into it now. The report, Left to Chance, Student Outcomes in Seattle Public Schools, a Forensic History. And you cover 1990 to 2024. Is that the right range? So it's a deep dive in decades, honestly, of organizational leadership in Seattle Public Schools. It's the largest K-12 system in the state of Washington, serves, I think, almost 50,000 students in more than 100 schools. Before we get into the particulars of the report, Left to Chance, I'm curious why you chose that title and sort of how it reflects the current state of things in Seattle Public Schools.
It's funny because the title kind of organically came to me as I was compiling all of what eventually went into the report. And some folks have asked me, how long did it take me to put together the report? And the answer was that it took me 6 weeks to write it, but 10 years to research it. And in the course of doing the research and trying to understand why things worked or didn't work the way that they do, or don't, it really struck me that while there are pockets of excellence in our system, there are schools and teachers who are doing just an incredible job, an exemplary job of providing their kids with educational opportunity. We have other schools and teachers who are really struggling to do the same thing, and that there really wasn't any kind of overarching system of support to make sure that all schools were equipped to deliver that kind of education to all children in our system. And it really struck me, it kind of kept coming back from this phrase over and again, that we really left things to chance. That sometimes things worked great, but other times they didn't. And nobody was really watching or trying to fix it in any sustained or consistent way. So, and then the irony, maybe it's not an irony, but the interesting part was that when I came to research the period between 2007 and 2011, at that point, Seattle Public Schools had hired a superintendent who came from outside of the district. She came from, I think she was from Charlottesville. Her name was Maria Goodlow Johnson. And one of the first things she did after she visited all the schools and she looked at the way the system works, she said, everyone's been doing their own thing here for a long time, and that leaves student learning to chance. I was like, oh my God, this is striking me now. I was writing, it was 2024, but she made this observation in 2007. So, there's clearly a through line here that involves that kind of like leaving things to chance.
I feel like she and every other, I'm saying character, but not in a bad way, every kind of character in this story seemed to me to be kind of an outsized personality in their own way. So this report is, as I mentioned, it's kind of trying to discuss organizational leadership, and it does it by analyzing these epochs of leadership in the district. You talk about different superintendents that are hired who come along, who have ideas to address reforms in the district. Some of them get implemented, some of them don't get implemented. You kind of described this pendulum swing in this reform where we go back and forth between market-based reforms, strategies sort of centered on this belief in school autonomy, like at the building level, really, it sounds like autonomy and competition driving innovation. And then on the other end, we've got this more standardized and centralized and accountability-oriented approach. As you detail in the report, both ends of this pendulum offer strengths and weaknesses in terms of the educational experience for students and parents and community members and administrators and everybody else. But I'm curious, do you feel like public schools are pressured to embrace one end or the other? Do you think this is a false choice? Do you think it's possible to achieve a balance between like a strong central vision and local innovation?
What a great question. So to me, the context for the answer really is a historic context. And you describe it as a pendulum swing, and I think it is, but I think it's a pendulum swing over a really long period.
Yeah, for sure.
As I see it, this whole thing started in the 70s with the oil crisis and the economic crash. And this is the first time since the Second World War that the US economy started to decline or contract, really. And that caused this massive reckoning. And there was this huge communal soul searching about what had caused this, sudden dip. You've seen generations of growth, and now suddenly growth was contracting. And this is when you saw the rise of kind of neoliberalism and Reagan. There were the 9 most terrifying words are, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. Like that idea that government was a problem.
Yeah. It's the nation at risk era kind of. We've
exactly.
talked about that. We've talked about that report on our podcast before, but that's a
fantastic
big moment in the history of American education policy reform.
And that's kind of the fruit of this kind of like everything's overregulated and everything's bad. And so you get a nation at risk saying one of the reasons why we're now uncompetitive, whether the Japanese are eating our lunch now economically, is because our schools are so terrible. Our education system is so terrible. I'm sure you've talked at length about how controversial that report was and still is. Yeah. But, no matter whether it was accurate or not, it launched this school reform movement that kind of started in the early 80s. And really, we've seen that arc continue until relatively recently. The zenith of that movement was the No Child Left Behind Act. And that kind of system of, first of all, the federal government being really involved in education, which it hadn't been before that, really, not at that level. And also requiring as a condition of Title I funding that a state required districts to impose this escalating system of accountability that was quite punitive. That actually never was fully implemented in Washington State. Washington State has very strong commitment to the idea of local control in education, as I know many states do, but it's particularly strong here. But for various reasons, that system was never fully implemented here. So that concept of school-based management really grew out of that business-oriented idea of, like government's the problem, we need to privatize. If you can't privatize something, a public entity, you need to run it like a business. That mechanism, that system that was brought in here in the 90s was kind of an example of that. And it has worked elsewhere. It actually originated in Edmonton, Alberta in the 70s, where I understand it was quite successful. And this system was modeled on that one. And the idea was that by making schools like markets with customers who had the choice of any school in the district, you'd have this feedback loop where if the customers didn't like the product, they could move their child to another school that would be better. And then the money moved with the kid. And if the school A that the child lost enough students, it would close for want of funding. So it's this pure market feedback. It never worked here like that. So I think what happened was we in Seattle got to the point by around 2010, 2011, where the superintendent at that time, who was the person I was talking about earlier, was ready to implement this No Child Left Behind style accountability mechanism, which is very centralized, right? It's like very top down. So the opposite of what we had started with in the 90s. But she did it at a time when No Child Left Behind had become just so unpopular that it basically collapsed, like right before the Chicago Teachers Union strike in 2012. Pretty much, to me, that was the end of No Child Left Behind. I mean, it linked on for a few years, and now we have, ESSA.
It lost all its teeth at that time too. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. So, it kind of, that consensus, as far as there was one, and there was, it collapsed. And I don't think anything's replaced it. That's the interesting thing. I think we're in the process of figuring out now and we have so much instability now at so many levels, but it's like, what does that look like going forward? Because the need for that accountability hasn't gone away. No. But that model of accountability was non-functional. It had really terrible downsides. It was the wrong answer to the right question kind of thing. So I look at it as that it is a pendulum swing, but it's a pendulum swing that, has taken 30 plus years.
Decades.
And
yeah.
Well, how are they currently funded? What is the current funding model? And then, how much of it has been carried over? I pulled out a couple of quotes. One was about how the original intent was to drive more funding to schools that were newly serving larger portions of students with more complex educational needs. And then later, the report mentioned, that there was an unanticipated $33 million budget hole. So, following that path, what is it now? What kind of carryover? $33 million budget hole is huge. And I work in a very small district, so that's multiple times what my district's budget is. But I'm trying to calculate it.
Yeah, it was at the time, actually. It was about 10% of the total district budget at that time. So the model was, the idea was to push as much money directly to the school level as possible, because schools were all supposed to function like independent businesses. And, a business can't function has control of its budget. So I think in Edmonton, which was the model district, I don't think this is still true, but certainly at its high watermark, about 90% of the school's budgets, the school district budget was being pushed out to schools individually for them to decide what to do with. Here in Seattle, it never got to more than about 60%. And that only lasted maybe 10 years.
Interesting.
Yeah. And one of the points of having this student-weighted formula that we had, the student-based budgeting, where dollars were allocated based on the characteristics of the actual students in the building, is that it didn't necessarily drive more dollars to higher needs schools, because such a huge proportion of any school's budget is staff. And that money was allocated on the basis of district-wide average salaries. So the money wasn't paying for the people who are actually in the building. And of course, you have the phenomenon that's not universal by any means, but many schools serving high-need populations have more junior teachers and higher teacher turnover. And so the staffing costs, at least, are cheaper at a school like that than they are at more affluent schools that have So that was the way it was advertised, was that, well, we have this formula where the money follows the students and it's based on student need, and it really didn't work out that way because they didn't use actual salaries.
Right.
So at its most expansive point, schools had about 60% of their budget was something that they could deploy. We're back to about 2% now.
Wow.
But, yeah, so it's mostly not at all discretionary. Yeah. There's very little that they actually have control over, unless you're able to bring in resources from outside of the school. So that's parent fundraising or grants or anything like that. That money, and very little of that's discretionary too. I mean, if you get a grant, you usually have pretty stringent requirements for how that's going to be used. If you have money from parents, you can use it however you want.
Sure.
So the only truly discretionary funding in our system now comes from families who are donating to their PTAs or their parent organizations and things like that.
Yeah, supporting a classroom or whatever the needs are directly. Right. Yeah.
So this interplay between missing accountability mechanisms, the way budgeting works, this concern that we see emerge from that nation at risk era where public education is a monopoly without an incentive to improve. There was a quote from a one-time NEA president in your report talking about how we have to revitalize our public schools from within or they're going to be dismantled from without. I feel that ringing in my ears almost daily now, as we see the Department of Education struggle to hold on to its identity right now. But I'm curious about this backdrop and how that plays into the hiring of John Stanford, Major General John Stanford. This is one of the big characters in your report. He's hired as the superintendent of Seattle Public Schools in 1995. He seems to play a pretty big role in this history, this dialogue that we're talking about school management and how it works. Can you just say a little bit about who he is and why he's important to this story?
Yeah, sure. So John Stanford, Major General John Stanford, he was a military guy, he was a retired Army general, and he was in charge of logistics during the first Gulf War. And he had been the, I think, executive assistant to Caspar Weinberger, who was the U.S. Secretary of Defense. So, had an incredible resume. Right? And he was actually headhunted by the Seattle School Board at the time. He was working as a county administrator in Georgia. And they found him and they convinced him to come in. Yeah. And they loved him. They didn't want to the folks in Georgia were like, don't take him. We need this guy. Right. He's ours. Don't touch him. But I don't know how they did it, but the school board convinced him to come to Seattle, where there had been years of conversation about doing these kinds of reforms. So he didn't come in, he didn't sort of like parachute in, so to speak, and say, we're going to do this here. There had been years of discussion about, and a few little pilots, of schools that were allowed to take, to control their own budgets and so forth. But we had a majority of folks on the school board who were very sort of business oriented and really wanted that kind of market-based accountability system to be brought in Seattle. To this day, we have schools named after him. Our district headquarters is named after him. He's kind of a byword for educational excellence, if you will, in Seattle Public Schools to this day.
Yeah, the board director at the time, you included that quote. What he said, that if you want to transform an institution that's been stagnant for decades, the last place you look for a leader is inside the institution. Mm-hmm. When I took notes on this, I highlighted that because I was like, I need to ponder this because I'm not sure at what level I agree with this, or if at any level, I guess. And so last night when Chelsea and I were talking through some of this, she's like, what do you think of that? And I was like, I still don't know. I've watched communities in my area and their schools try to change and grow, and it's without the outside coming in, And so I think there is some stuck in that way. So it makes sense.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we're having that conversation yet again here in Seattle because our current superintendent has just announced that he's stepping down. And I cannot tell you how many conversations I've had in the last couple of weeks where people are like, should they hire someone from outside?
Really?
Should they hire a non-educator? Should they hire someone from inside? So it's still.
Has that been since the report was published that they announced that? Okay. Because I was going to say, you go through a quite a history of
This is the hiring process.
Yeah. Again and again, the
Mhm.
hiring process of trying to find
Mhm.
national searches for superintendents. And, this is not pointing any fingers. These things are difficult and frequently
Oh,
contentious,
yeah.
but
Mhm.
it sounds like the process was fraught at least a couple of times with candidates withdrawing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There were multiple times. I mean, so after Stanford, we had someone hired, his second in command was hired who had no previous educational experience. He was an investment banker. And then after him, it was the guy who cleaned up after that guy. And then because everybody else dropped out, I assume that folks came and interviewed and were like, maybe I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Can
Can I make this better? Or
That's
that's a big ask.
Well,
it is big. It is.
I just wanted to ask about why it was a big ask. And you were observing the district had devolved into 100+ separate school systems, is what I think one of those superintendents in that line observed at some point. And that does sound like a big ask to try to give strategy to such a disjointed group of independently functioning buildings with independent, leaders in every one of them. I'm curious about what the impact of that 100 separate school systems was on learners in the district.
Has there been any discussion to break it up either? I know I'm kind of asking a weird question, but just because of the unique nature of Seattle Public, have they ever discussed
Yeah. It's not an
or
awkward
whatever?
question. Yeah, it's not an awkward question because it comes up pretty cyclically in Seattle and in Washington. I'm not aware of that conversation ever happening internally.
Sure.
Other than probably people just saying it and passing out of frustration. Right?
Yeah.
But there have been relatively serious conversations at the state legislative level about doing that. So, and it comes around probably every 5-6 years. Somebody in the legislature will be like, God damn it, let's just break this thing up. It'll work.
We just break them up so I can have, it makes sense. Given this report, I can understand why there might be an argument that it might be stronger separate.
Right. It is really interesting. Yeah.
I can't imagine the student experience of extreme decentralization like that. The sort of concept of school choice that has infused public education at this point. How do you make a meaningful school choice if we're comparing apples to oranges in terms of school resources, school, test performance, whatever standard we might use? Or is that the point, just to not have any of those standards available because we're 100 different school systems? It feels like a weird place to be caught as a learner or a parent in that system, trying to figure out, where do I go? What do I do if I want to get involved? If I want to change the stakes, if I want to become a part of the system, how do I do it? How do I raise concerns up the chain of command or things like that?
Well, it's part of the catch-22 of our system. So folks want to get involved, but there's no clear avenue for doing that beyond your own child's school. And I keep finding myself using this phrase, nailing jelly to a wall, because anything that you do here that's kind of aimed at improvement, whether it be a group of families or a group of educators or the superintendent or the school board, you can get all the planets aligned. And the minute one of those elements changes, it's gone, and then you have to start that whole process again. So it is immensely frustrating for all of the stakeholders in the system to try to, because of that diffusion and that atomization of our system. And it wasn't meant to be that way. And I think it ties back into that accountability conversation. And I hesitate to use the word accountability because it just does sound so punitive and it's not intended to, but it's just that kind of when I say accountability, I mean that insight into what's happening at every location in the system and where do folks need more support and how do we plug that in? I mean, that's what I mean by accountability. It's not oh, you're not doing the right thing. And so it's not that. It's okay, let's make sure that everyone's doing what we're hoping they're doing. And if they're not, we're getting them the support they need to do it. So John Stanford actually had a kind of backup to this market-based system of accountability, whether customers would move their widgets around, if you will, based on whether they liked the schools or not. He had this thing called the Focus Schools program or Focus Schools initiative, where you let schools go free and you let them do their thing and you subjected them to the judgment of the market. But if things really just weren't happening for kids in that school after a couple of years, the district could go in and, again, it was sort of proto No Child Left Behind. There was this escalating series of steps up to the district taking over the school or reconstituting the school or things that then did come into play during No Child Left Behind. And that was a really short-lived program. And when he passed away, that program went away completely and just left this kind of system that was supposed to run itself somehow. And that's when you got those 100 different school districts happening. And, you know, there's these audits that came out of those years. So we're talking, these audits were done between 2006 2008, but they were really audits of what happened in the district between around 2000, maybe 1999 and 2003 or 4. And they said, like, the outcomes for some kids have been incredible. There are some schools that have taken this freedom, this autonomy, and have been able to, for various reasons, to do amazing things with it. But there are some schools that have not been able to do that. And the outcomes for kids in those schools are extraordinarily poor and have been for a while. And those students are disproportionately Black and brown students, students with IEPs, so students with disabilities, students living in poverty, and English language learners. And these were the exact students that the district was supposedly trying to support by improving and reforming the system. So that was kind of unfortunately, that was the eventual sort of product of this system the way it was, or non-system.
I'm curious to hear your take on how much you think the project of reform is a project of finding and recruiting the right people, the right leaders, the right staff, the people problem. It sounds like there's some people leadership elements involved in this equation. There are also structural elements, policy, design, and who answers to whom, and intricacies of board control, and that all of those parts of that story are what sounded to me so familiar. Small school districts around here where we are in rural Ohio, but it's the same story of educational leadership and how breakdowns at the level of strategic vision will always trickle down no matter what.
So there's a writer he was a professor at Harvard University called Richard Elmore, wrote a lot about educational reform. And he said that education policy or thinking suffers from this fantasy that if you just recruit the right people, everything will work, right? And he talked about how the basic model of educational improvement in our system is this idea of volunteerism, the idea that you need to convince folks to improve, and that's the way you'll get improvement. And he said you never get more than about 25% of people in that boat anyway. And without support, they burn out. So it's really more of a structural problem. Now, the point that he got to by the end of his career, he's passed away now, he said that he didn't think that the model of education that we have is salvageable, and he didn't think it could function at all. So, and that's a whole other conversation, but it was just interesting to see his progression from here to there. But I do think, and I say this as someone who did not grow up here and went to school in a very different system, I do think some of the problem is baked into the way education is structured in the United States. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It reflects the values of Americans, and in that sense, it's appropriate. But the problem is that you have competing, as with anything, right? You have these competing values. One is like effectiveness, and people want their schools to work for kids. Although there's a whole nother conversation in there too about which kids.
Or do they want their kids to work for the system? Yeah.
Right.
No, that's exactly the question, though.
Mm-hmm, right. So, I mean, there is this desire for effectiveness, but there's also this desire for really local control, and this idea that each community is best positioned to make those decisions for itself. And those communities can be really small, or they can be big like Seattle. When that idea of market-based reform was becoming popular, there was a book that was published in the 90s, Markets, Politics, and America's Schools, by two authors called Chubb and Moe. It was hugely influential. This was like the second wave of that reform that came after it, A Nation at Risk. So the first wave was like standards. We need more rigorous standards for our students. We need to make sure that they're reaching these standards before they graduate. We need teachers that are better trained and this kind of thing. And then the second wave was this idea like, oh my God, we need deep structural reform, because that didn't really do much. So the second wave was about like really changing the system. And their thesis was that democratic control of schools can't work. So they meant things like school boards and state legislatures and agencies being overseeing education, because there's so much instability, political instability, that you end up without the capacity to really make things stick. And they kind of point out that in homogeneous communities, like small homogeneous communities where you have a consensus on education, you can use those democratic control tools because there isn't that much of a political swing. But in bigger, more fractious systems like we have here in Seattle, where people really feel very passionate about K-12 education, they're very involved, which is amazing and awesome, and it's an asset for our community. But it's like, it makes it much harder to reach the kind of consensus that makes that democratic control stable enough to, I mean, that's one way to theorize it, right? I'm not sure if I agree with that or not, but that would be their theory, is that it can't work in our school district because it's too big and it's too diverse, and we can't ever reach a point where we can agree on what we're doing so that that democratic control can provide consistent leadership for school improvement. So it's both.
Yeah. I keep banging up against this values question that you mentioned. And I want to say that if there's a division between two camps, it's people who conceive of the project of public education by borrowing from this market-based language so much that we start to really believe in our own creed and treat education as a product that is kind of nice to consume, and I might as well try to get the best bang for my buck with my investment. The sort of damaging leftover of leaning too hard into that rhetoric is that we start to think of education as a nice to have instead of the necessary precondition for the functioning of democracy. But I'm curious what the alternative is, or how you would conceive of the alternative.
Well, I tend to think that society's orientation to education that way is very much dependent on what your underlying values are. Like, it's the underlying values drive what comes out in your education system, rather than, and of course it's a feedback loop, I think. But what your question is making me think of, there's another professor by the name of David Labarre, and he wrote a really fascinating, I'm just looking at the title of it here, an article in 1997. It's called Public Goods, Private Goods, The American Struggle Over Educational Goals. This is one of the papers that I read that really just completely changed the way I think about education in this country. And he actually goes through the history of what it was that the education system here in America was intended to do from its inception. And he talks about how there were two main goals that kind of flowed back and forth, and they're not actually mutually exclusive. And they were the goals that really were predominant until probably the 90s. And they were education for democratic citizenship and the production of a workforce. So you had, we're producing workers for capitalism, and we're producing democratic citizens who can maintain the republic. Right? And then his observation, his sort of like novel observation at the time, was that he said these things can exist together. You can have those two. They have a little bit of tension, but they can exist together, and they don't necessarily, neither of them pushes the other one out or makes the other one impossible. By the 90s, he said he's starting to observe this third value that was being brought into the school system, and that was the idea of personal advancement, of education as a tool for personal and individual opportunity. And he said that one can't coexist, at least with the democratic citizenship one, because it's all about the individual and about maximizing individual opportunity, which has to come at the expense of others. And that one is inherently corrosive of the idea of we are educating our children to be citizens of a collective community. Those things can't coexist. So to me, it's kind of like a chicken and egg problem. Do our schools and the way they operate reflect what our society believes and values? I think the answer is yes. Do they also influence that? Yes, they do. So I think it's a feedback cycle that at this point has amplified.
I think that education has, at least around here, suffered a bit from so much energy being expended on the competition and missing energy being expended on defining shared goals, shared community values, shared vision. And it's kind of weird because then in this kind of like devolved local control model, you don't have any of that. It's just like, okay, I've got local control, but of what and toward what end? Like, I've been trusted with ownership, but there's no, like, we don't agree on where we're going, like where the bus is headed. So,
right. And I think, there's a lot of evidence that the human species has been successful because we know how to collaborate. I think that's what made us successful in the first place. And then that's wired into us. There's all sorts of books being written about that, right? And then I think the other element to that is that it makes sense for people when they're thinking about their children's education to want to maximize their potential, because the alternative is really bad. Like there's really not a social safety net in this country.
We've made the stakes inordinately high.
Right. I mean, in some other countries, whether you everyone should learn to read, there's no question. But whether you learn to read or not, you can still survive. You'll still have a basically dignified standard of living. You may never be wealthy, you may never be, famous, whatever, but you'll be assured some basic standard of living, whereas that's not necessarily the case here. So the stakes are extraordinary.
Not at all. Well, how are the students doing? What has all of this shown? Like, are we closing gaps, or is graduation rate higher?
There absolutely has been progress. Things are way better than they were in, let's say, like 2007, 2008, 2009. We did have a period here where there was a lot, just before the pandemic, actually, the years before the pandemic, even though we didn't have any, the attempt to pull the system together in a really organized way never really happened. We did end up with a lot of alignment between, the superintendent, district staff, and individual schools on the work that needed to be done. And they were really doing a lot of that work together, and you were seeing quite a bit of improvement. By this point, that market-based system had been almost completely eliminated. Most of the elements of it were gone. So it couldn't be said to be in place in any meaningful sense. It hadn't been replaced with anything else. But you had just this moment where you had almost all stakeholders aligned on, okay, we're not going to say you have to do X, but we're going to say this is what we are going to do as a district. And if you want the support to do that, we're going to support you. We're actually going to give you robust and meaningful support from the district level to implement these initiatives into your schools to improve outcomes for students. And so that did happen for 3 or 4 years. And so you did see improvement. And what we've seen, COVID was just a disaster for almost every school district in this country. So, it's like a meteor hitting the education system, right? And so since then, you've seen sort of stagnation and backsliding for all sorts of reasons. And also the disappearance of that consensus around, for us here in Seattle at least, that we're all doing these particular strategies and that we're all aligned. So that kind of, because of COVID and because of various other things that happen on a local level, but that's really kind of disappeared here. So we haven't seen a whole lot of backsliding, but we haven't seen much progress since 2018.
So you mentioned Seattle Public is on the hunt for a superintendent again, freshly. If you were a fly on the wall in that process, or I guess if you had a chance to define the ideal candidate right now for this, based on everything that you have, that you've found in your research here, there's no probably perfect candidate, but what are the ideal qualities that are called for right now to meet the persistent challenges?
Mm-hmm. I think for me, it has to be somebody who understands school and system improvement. And I think ideally it would be somebody who has classroom experience. This is actually something I came to recently, but I think a big part of the problem that at least we had and that No Child Left Behind represented was this kind of ignoring teachers. Any organization that functions needs to ask the people who are actually doing the work, what's working, what's not, how do we support you? And that, I think, kind of has never really happened on any scale here. So I think someone who at least has some level of understanding of what happened in classrooms, of what we're asking teachers to do, and can bring that back to a systems perspective and say, okay, here's what we're asking our educators to do. And frankly, a lot of it is impossible, at least with the tools that we've given educators right now. How do we bring enough people in the system together to give us a really good view of what's not working? So you really need someone with that kind of both an understanding of the work itself. I mean, the work of an education system is educating children, and that's what teachers do. So they need to understand the teacher perspective. And they also need to understand the system's perspective and the pressures that come from the outside on this system, from the state, from the federal government. I mean, especially now, it's an incredibly difficult job. How do you navigate that? And then on top of it, someone like Seattle, this is a highly political education system. And that's just who we are. We like to argue about our school. Everyone's very invested in it, which again is fantastic. But also that's kind of the other side of the coin is that it can get very contentious. So someone who can navigate that kind of politics without losing the perspective on what we're here for is children and their future. Like that's my unicorn.
It is a unicorn.
it's both inspiring to know that everybody across the country is facing similar
Is it?
challenges, but well, you're
Also
not
depressing?
alone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can
No,
call it
it
what you
is.
want, but
And I would love to know where you think that tendency to skip over the teacher's perspective comes from, because I also see that here, even in much smaller school districts. Does that come because of these national accountability mechanisms? How did that start? How do we kind of get this like missing middle of the key, the key point of connection between policy and students is teachers in the classroom? How did we get to this point that teachers are just kind of skipped over, especially in the policy conversations?
I mean, I think it goes back to teaching for such a long time being associated with women and therefore being a low status job, and that you didn't need to listen to those women because they were women and who cares? They couldn't possibly know what they were doing. So, right. So,
Yeah.
like, I think that's a big part of it. And I think I'm going to kind of noodle out loud here because this is a half-formed thought. But during the early reform period, so the early 80s, right after A Nation at Risk, one of the big conversations was around teacher quality and attracting. So this is, at a time when second wave feminism had been pretty successful in expanding occupational choices for women, like career choices for women. And so there was this kind of undercurrent of like, oh, well, now we're not getting the best women for teaching because they're going off and being lawyers and doctors and, airline pilots and what have you. So how do we attract really strong candidates to teaching? And part of that whole school-based management package was the idea that the way to attract quality candidates to teaching was to teach, to make sure that teaching was really a professional job. And professionals are people who don't necessarily take direction from above. They actually have, the ability, they have experience and they have training, and they can exercise their own clinical judgment and work with other professionals to bring their, their knowledge and their expertise to bear on a problem and fix it in this kind of iterative process of improvement, right? And so the idea was to create these schools that would allow teachers to do that. And so I wonder if we skipped straight over, well, they're all women and they don't know what they're doing, to they know exactly what they're doing and they can do it without any help. And we don't need to consult them because all we need to do is create a framework and they'll go off and do the magic. But it's this kind of black box of here's where the magic happens and off you go and do that. And you don't need any help to do that. And we don't need to ask you about it. But yeah, that's my wondering.
What lesson can state legislatures learn from like the work of your report that you've done here? Because I feel like that's, to me, the takeaway is like we got to change the process by which we create accountability. I mean, I know you're saying it's been a harsh word, but like how we create a system where students and teachers and parents and administrators can all feel enfranchised toward these goals.
That's something I've been grappling with a lot lately because the state in Washington is very hands-off in terms of education. We have a lot of advising and suggesting, but there's really not a lot of implementing or anything like that. I think the thing about legislators is, as well-meaning as many of them are, I mean, you have to be to go into but most people go into public service at that level because they want to help their communities and the community at large. Most of them don't know anything about education. And they have so many things coming at them, right? Like backyard chickens and licensing and ambulances and like boat building. Like how can they become, very few of them are experts in this particular area. So I think that's where some of the problem comes from. And then also I think we have a tendency to kind of see that there's this big intractable problem and want to slap some kind of fix on it. And that's been part of the problem over this particular period, is this idea, we tried that, now we're trying this, and if I just wait it out, it'll be something else next week. I cannot keep up with all this, right? And so it's hugely disabling. But one of the things that struck me in looking at Seattle public schools, for example, is that it's really hard to do this reform from inside the district. It really needs to be in a bigger container, if you will, of structure, because otherwise we're trying to build the structure, but again, because of politics here, especially, and just historically, it's very hard for us to reach a consensus on what that should look like. And one of the things that I've been looking at is the correlation, and correlation's not causation, but the correlation between states that have really good academic outcomes. And I want to acknowledge that academic outcomes are not the only outcomes that matter, but they're the thing we have most measured over the years. States that have really good academic outcomes and what their school improvement mechanisms look like at the state level. And so a lot of our stronger states have these really robust monitoring, support, and intervention systems for schools. It's not that they are like fix this or we're going to come take over your school. It's like, okay, we're going to identify. And some of this came out of No Child Left Behind, and it's kind of what got carried over into Every Student Succeeds. But different states have taken it to different extents. And so there are many states that have this kind of like, okay, we're going to monitor how all of the schools in our state are doing, relatively sophisticated way of measuring and monitoring that. And then a really robust system for intervening in those schools in the sense of like, you need this support and we're going to give it to you, whether it's in the form of grants or actual technical assistance or what have you. But then a lot of the stronger ones had this third step, which is like, okay, we'll give you 3 years, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years. But if we're not seeing improvement, there is this last step, which we will almost never take, but we have it. And we're going to do this for those schools because we aren't going to accept this forever. This is not okay because these kids are only in school for 13 years and it's up like that, right? Like we were experimenting on our children, but these kids are still going through the system as we're trying all these things. So they're like if we don't see improvement in this period of time, so you see, Massachusetts will, what do they call it? I think they put schools into receivership, where the state takes over. And I don't know whether that works well, but I do know that Massachusetts has fantastic. And again, there's obviously many elements that go into their success, but that was just something that struck me, was that they have this.
What's cultural?
Florida.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that
really
goes back to my, that goes back to my wondering about, is the answer the people or the structure? But it's like, our education systems reflect our underlying culture and underlying values. Even if they're not my values, they're like, altogether, they're the values of my community. That's what my school system is going to look like.
Mm-hmm.
So
I cut you off. Yeah. You were going to talk about Florida.
Oh no, I was going to say, Florida is another example of a state that actually has pretty strong academic outcomes and also has pretty much a No Child Left Behind system. They've taken that and continued it. And Texas is not up the top, but it's relatively close, and it has a accreditation system. And actually, there's a Department of Defense schools, which are by far the best schools in the country by a lot. The distance between their outcomes and the next, there's all sorts of reasons for that, right? But they also have an accreditation system. So it's a wondering that I have whether some part of it. But, as in terms of state level action, it seems like it's helpful if at the state level there is some like really structured supports for schools, and then some kind of like, okay, we're not going to let you struggle forever.
I thought it was interesting that you mentioned Massachusetts because we were in Boston in November for a teacher conference, and I talked to a few teachers that were not in Boston but in the area and could commute in and out, and they all talked about how competitive it is there to get any kind of education job, and how there is no teacher shortage, and there will probably be no teacher shortage for the foreseeable future. And so hearing that, we're in Boston, so you've got Harvard, you got Boston, like rich history and rich schools. And so like all of that at play. And then, I'm sitting with these random teachers and they're like, oh my gosh, I tried to get into my school district for years and years and years. And I'm sitting there thinking, if you walked into most schools in Ohio today, you would have it, and so I'm hearing all these words and I'm like, oh my gosh, if only there was another job here for me, because no, don't get me wrong, there are issues everywhere, but I thought it was interesting you brought that up because every single teacher that I met from Massachusetts is like, oh gosh, yeah, I worked so hard to get this job. Not like I didn't try to get my job, but
Sure. No, I know what you're saying. It's like, it's interesting. It's like, why can't that be the case everywhere? Right. And some of it does go back to funding. And there was that 1973 Supreme Court decision, San Antonio and Rodriguez, that said, you're not entitled to an equitable education. That's not in the Constitution. We still have this absurd funding model where it really depends on your zip code, right? But that's not all of it, right? And obviously you're not going to have a nationwide model here because that's not how things are done. But how can states and districts and schools take practices that work elsewhere and figure out if they would work here? Would it work here or not? And if it doesn't, that's fine. Sometimes things won't work locally, but we don't even have that system really for sharing things that work.
So if you could implement just any one major change in Seattle public schools, like tomorrow, that you've kind of stumbled
and you had the money.
Yeah.
And you had the support and you had everything you needed.
Yeah. Assume you have all the resources that you need to actually implement it. But what would be the first thing you're going to do?
Well, I'm going to cheat and say two things. And one is going to be this is free thing. And the other thing's going to be this costs money. And the free thing is that, because I really do believe that you can't do anything except through relationships of trust. and through consensus, because that's what democracy is, right? It's process, and that's better or worse. We're still in one, so, and especially at the local level, right? Things proceed that way. You can't get anything to stick otherwise. I really want for our community to look at what we have, which is a weird hybrid system that doesn't work for anybody. It's not a market system. It's not a centralized system. It's kind of a nothing system. Just lay everything out, take it all apart and look at it and figure out what we want to keep and what we don't want to keep and what's going to work for kids. So I want that structural conversation to happen. Probably will never happen. The not free thing would be community schools, a community schools model. Because I think a lot of the stress on schools comes from the fact that we really don't have a great social safety net. And schools are being asked not just to educate kids, but to take care of the full spectrum of their needs. And there are kids, I mean, how can you possibly come to school and be ready to learn if you're hungry or you slept in your car last night?
Yep.
Or, then it's so, of course, my fantasy is that that no longer happens. We don't have those things happening to children or adults. That's a long-term project, obviously. In the meantime, can we at least have all of the, and this actually might be an answer to the what can the state do thing, but all of these agencies of the state that we do have that support kids and families need to be part of that structure of schooling. Quick little anecdote. During the pandemic, I found out that despite having a state health department and a county health department and a city health department, our district was required to set up its own little mini health department to administer COVID protocols and testing. And that just blew my mind. It's like, we're already doing that. We're actually replicating that elsewhere. Why can't they just come in? And there's no relationship between those entities in our state that would have allowed them to just come in and do that. And there was some.
It was the exact same thing here.
Like one person from each district was in charge of COVID protocols. And he basically just emailed us the PDF from the local health department.
Yeah, and that's fascinating that it was the same thing. I mean, it doesn't surprise me because it kind of gels with what I understood to happen. But yeah, at a really meta level, this comes back to the fact that you have a bigger system, and I'm talking about on the national level, designed for like a small agrarian society that's being tasked with managing the complexities of what we have now. And it's like, it's just, it can't do it. It's okay when things are going great, but they haven't been going great for a while. So, it just
especially
can't
as
function. So.
communities rely more and more on the education systems to do what they didn't used to do. We have a discrepancy right now in my district where one of our elementary schools got some like press for high reading scores and our other elementary school didn't. As we were talking about it, my coworkers were like, well, the one school that did better has a preschool attached to it and the other school that doesn't. And so we were going through all of the things that, because we hear from kindergarten teachers who say, my first 2 weeks of school are tying shoes and pulling up our pants and whatever else. And then the other school is like, we're moving. We've had preschool. And so you don't think about that stuff, though. You don't think about the setbacks. And I mean, you do because you're a parent and things like that. But I don't think a lot of times that people realize that sending your kid to school at whatever age is not actually always made based on what's the best decision for this learner. It is, can I afford childcare? Does my schedule allow this? Or whatever. And so, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but these are all the things that, as you were saying it, I was like, oh.
No, I mean, I saw that so many times. And one of the problems with the way our school system is structured, this isn't just in the United States, but is that idea that time is the constant and learning is the variable. So we have you for X amount of time. If you don't learn what we are teaching you within that time, I'm sorry. And also, you come to school at 5, whether you're ready or not. And if you can't keep up, then, well, that's kind of on you, So like that really deep structural idea of could we flip? I mean, people have been talking about this for decades. Is there some way to, like this structure? I started the report with that quote that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it does. So that's what we have.
Seemed like you managed to strike a hopeful tone, even despite all of these challenges with the report, with your work. What makes you, if anything, optimistic moving forward?
I think it's because it's always darkest right before the dawn. I really think that
it's got to be.
Right. It's like we kind of hit rock bottom here. And I know that there's always further to go. But just in terms of that big arc, I see that big structural arc the big arc of structural reform has really come to a close. And that creates both problems because things are falling apart. Because a lot of these reforms were not based on, we're not keeping children and their interests at the center. They really weren't. It was kind of like, how do we get to that indirectly by doing all these other things? It's like, what if we started with kids this time, and just designed a system that met their needs? Now, I don't know if we have the political will to do that, but there's at least the opportunity at this point because the paradigm that we had is exhausted. And I think there's almost uniform agreement on that. Whether you liked it or not, it's done.
All right. Well, we have a tradition of asking people on the show one thing they've learned in the last couple of weeks. It doesn't have to be related to this conversation that we're having, but just anything that you're geeking out about, book you read, whatever you want to share with our listeners. Let us know.
Well, I wasn't sure whether it was meant to be related to this or not. So I have two little factoids, so you can pick which one. So the education-related one was that, fascinatingly, in the very early days of the charter school movement, some of the earliest charter schools that were ever founded were actually sponsored by the National Education Association, the umbrella union organization, which was fascinating. And there's a whole story there.
Yeah.
The non-educational fact I just learned recently, thanks to, I think, one of my children, was that some snails have up to 25,000 teeth.
No.
I kid you not.
No.
I'm upset by this.
No. No.
They're
No,
very,
thank you.
very small.
Oh my goodness.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
gonna have to Google that. Not
Yeah,
because I don't
really.
believe you, but just because I want to see it.
No,
I totally
Yeah.
trust that.
What did you learn in the last couple of weeks, Kate?
I started learning Polish. So I'm going to be traveling to Poland this summer for a week.
Oh.
So I am being harassed by the Duolingo bird daily, and he is bullying me into opening that app. It's a hard language. It is not super friendly to the American in the room. So, but it's hard. Chelsea, what you got?
Mine's a little bit boring, but necessary. I just spent some time learning about the upcoming primary and special election on May 6th here in Ohio. I was just learning about all of the issues because there are tons of them. So the upcoming election.
Good.
Yeah. All right. Well, Vivian, thank you so much for joining us. This is a really fascinating report, fascinating conversation. I love the resource that you have become for Seattle, what your organization is doing, and we wish you luck. We'll share the link to this report for our listeners. You can find it in our show notes, 16to1.com/archives. Everything is there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was awesome to talk with you both.
Hey listeners, thanks for supporting 16 to 1. We're your co-hosts. I'm Chelsea Adams.
And I'm Katie Day. Find our show notes, archives, and resources, sign up for our newsletter, or get in touch with us via the contact form at 16to1.com, all spelled out.
We are so grateful for our listener support. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the show and telling your friends or colleagues about it.
The show is edited and produced by you, Chelsea Adams, and you're also responsible for our show's music.
And you, Katie Day, serve as lead researcher and social media manager.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next show.